video of the auction, blah blah blah, noise-making, nonsense, autistic gibberish. The house was nowhere near as isolated as it was in 1957. Wow, get a life, the Geinfo theory is the shit. Here's the house. Yeah, that's how it shows when you lack oxygen at birth. Even your mother can't stand you, besides being a cunt. Unintelligible growling, time wasting, good story bro, titties, done. Can you believe they came back? After the rubbish I fed them last time. Titties jokes. Really? What a bunch of tards. Would I have popped them out, I would sue my own box. On November 16, 1957, a call is made to the sheriff's office to report the disappearance of Bernice Worden, owner of the hardware store in Plainfield. The sheriff is told by the son of the victim that a certain Ed Gein might have something to do with it. A policeman is sent to his house to interrogate him, but quickly figures out that Gein is not home. All the doors are locked but one. The one leading to the woodshed. By the way, my name is Jezebel Von Nipples, and today, I'm taking you down with me nowhere but to the very heart of the beast, the ghoul's lair abyss, the hatchery of madness in which grew up the godfather of serial killers, Ed Gein's living Carters.
This video is dedicated to the physical reconstitution of the building and not the events that took place there on November 16, 1957, which are here assumed to be familiar to the average gynologist. For a detailed account of the events, see Episode 5, the first day of their season.
So, without further ado, let's get right into it with this first picture here, one taken by Frank Scherschel of Life magazine on the reported date of November 20, 1957, on which we can see here Mr. James Halligan of the Wisconsin State Crime Lab, while stripping the house of all Gein's handicraft, in this very case, a chair upholstered with human skin. But for a better perspective, here's another picture taken closer to the chair and in broad daylight, on which not only can we see what appears to be rigor mortis stains suggesting that the skin was peeled off the back of one of his victims, but also to get a glimpse of the kind of work that has been done here. One must keep in mind that Gein's father worked for years in a tannery. In fact, it has been the most stable non-farming job he ever had, and one could bet he would have remained there longer was it not that it closed its doors, which I can't help but wonder how an orphan probably suffering of abandonment syndrome of any kind, getting his life together in the outside world for the first time in his late 20s, would have had to deal emotionally with such a situation. Knowing that George developed at some point a heavy drinking habit, prior to Ed's first memories, and that this is following the loss of his job at the tannery, the data shows George starting to jump from one occupation to the other, for reasons attributed by Gein, or in other words, by his mother, to the said alcohol issue. Okay. I get it, I'm sorry. The point being that it would be more than likely that George had passed down to his sons some of his knowledge in the art of the conservation of the skin. Back to the chair, one can't but notice here the Victorian fashion in which the skin is fixed to the wood frame with upholstery nails, but even more so, that it has been sit on enough times to make the leather a bit saggy. Which leads to the question, how many unsuspecting neighbors did actually sit in that chair, made of someone they probably knew by the way, and how often did it happen? A silly question might you think, given that nobody was allowed to enter Gein's house, otherwise they would have noticed something, right? Still, we can tell from documented sources that Gein would occasionally receive people at home, mostly kids of the neighborhood, like Bob Hill, son of Irene and Lester Hill, who knew Gein since childhood, and that his visitors would on such occasion sit in those chairs whose number, by the way, is evaluated at 1 by Life magazine, 2 or 3 by Alan Wilimovsky of the State Crime Lab, and up to 4 in Deviant, the shocking true story of Ed Gein. But, in the words of Georgia Foster, a neighbor who knew Gein enough to let him babysit her newborn and who visited his house as late as spring of 1957, if I came to your house, would I be looking at the chairs to see if they were made from human skin?
Were you ever apprehensive, Eddy, when your neighbors or friends that you invited or permitted to come into your house sat down on the chairs that they wouldn't get suspicious of what you had upholstered the chairs with?
No, I don't. Not to my knowledge.
Nobody has ever asked you if this
It
is...
might be a little that way, but lots of times, it never entered my mind they'd ever think of that. Sometimes, though, since you mentioned that, it would seem natural. I probably did sometimes feel, a little bit
conscious of.
That's right.
According to Captain Lloyd Scuffowester of Green Lake County, the chairs were crudely made. The outside portion would be smooth, and if you looked underneath, you could see strips of fat. It wasn't a good job, he added. But let's get back inside. First of all, one can deduce here from the angle at which we perceive the rafters on this picture, that the wall can't but be the one facing east or west, and knowing that the door on the west wall was not situated in the middle, that it was made of wood planks, and that it actually led outside, not only can we state that we are looking at the east wall of the shed, but that this very door here is the legendary one that led straight to Ed Gein's kitchen. Legend aside, it would be noteworthy to notice here what appears to be a stovepipe running across the room. Right next to the door we can see here a shopping bag on which one can read Vanity Kickbusch, a grocery store and distributor situated in Wausau, about 60 miles from Plainfield, a somehow considerable distance for someone as Gein who wasn't used to straying that far from home. Even to get corpses for that matter. Knowing that he used to occasionally go on errands for Irene and Lester Hill to help them filling the shelves of their own grocery store, where he himself used to buy his provisions, one can wonder if it would not be during one of these occasions that Ed would have bring it back home, or just that he was such a fan of the Vanity brand, that he was willing to go such a distance just to fulfill some gastronomic fancies of his. Hey, talking about gastronomic fancies. Not far from there, buried under what looks like a pile of old rags and dirty clothes, one can see here a cardboard box on which is printed the logo of Van Camp's Pork and Beans, a box that I suspect, besides Gein's own testimony about eating a lot of canned food, is at the origin of this passage of Deviant, Chapter 7, where one can read.
Throwing a few sticks of wood into his ancient cookstove, he gets a small fire going, just big enough to warm up his usual pork and beans supper.
An unusually specific detail that I've never seen mentioned prior to the publication of this book. Hey, talking about stuff one can read in Deviant. In the approximated same vicinity, one can see here fixed to the wall a funeral wreath, next to an oil lantern and a horseshoe, which is not only peculiar in itself, but also sounds strangely familiar to one introduced to the descriptions made of Gein's house in Deviant, the shocking true story of Ed Gein. And let me clarify straight away my position regarding descriptions of the house made in this book, just as in any other document by the way, the intent here not to ostracize it as somehow being worse than the others, which actually would happen to be quite the contrary. According to Wikipedia, the author of Deviant would have been 8 years old during this very short historical time window of 3 days situated between the time anyone cared about Gein's existence and the definitive shutting down of his farmhouse. So, growing up in a place I dare assume wasn't rural Wisconsin, wasn't coaxed into a road trip down to Gein's farmhouse by one of his uncles or something, or, I assume again, not in possession of a rare family album stolen from Gein's house before it burnt down, I can't but add another assumption over what's becoming a pile of them by now, and presume that to write his descriptions of inside the house, he had to rely on the same limited amount of pictures that we all have to be content with. Number of which I've seen a lot, if not most, which allows me to confidently distinguish which picture he was referring while writing his book, and de facto, genealogically correct if need be, some passage whose veracity doesn't pass the scrutiny like this one.
Then passing beneath a pair of deer antlers, a rusty horseshoe, and a withered Christmas wreath, all mounted over the doorway and dripping with cobwebs, he steps inside his bedroom.
The problem here being, 1, a Christmas wreath is mistakenly confused with a funeral one, 2, that it is mistakenly situated over a doorway that is mistakenly described as leading to Gein's bedroom, and this is not mentioning deer antlers that, despite the cultural context in which one could have expected to find them all over the place, are nowhere to be seen on any picture that I'm aware of. Hey, talking about stuff that doesn't make sense. On the top of a wooden crate filled with rags and a pair of unidentified white books, sits an issue of Official Detective Stories magazine that happens to be so conveniently disposed in relation to the photographer that a basic internet research allows us to identify as the edition of August 1956. So much well disposed actually, that it would stand out in a normal environment, let alone this one, but just keep it somewhere in the back of your mind for now, since this is a sub-level of rabbit hole we are going down later in this video. Join us! And because there's no such a thing as a horror house worthy of the name without a mysterious trap leading to dripping moist nightmarish darkness, here's what appears to be a trap accessing the shed's ground level, situated approximately under the double window near the little door of the north wall, which leads me to think that it was probably conceived for the storing of vegetables or something. Who knows if the door was open when the police first came in, but what I can say though, is that by using as a landmark the axe sitting on a rinso box near a huge can of dehydrated something, one can see here that this picture was taken from down that very trap, which allows us to get a glimpse at the window and of the south wall of the shed, and also a pretty good view on a potbelly stove in which Gein used to dispose of body parts that he didn't intend to keep. Fun fact, on this picture taken on the morning following the blaze, the potbelly stove was still visible peeking through the ashes. Taken from what would be near the potbelly stove, just like the first one was but facing the opposite wall, one can see here behind the gathered officials the solid wooden door that was painted white as described by Alan Wilimovsky, confirming, in addition to the angle of the rafters, that we are looking at the west wall of the shed. In order to demystify a singularity one needs to familiarize with to go farther in this reconstitution, here's a clip of an interview of Virgil Buck Batterman, then Sheriff of Plainfield, in which he claims to have been the one accompanying Sheriff Schley on November 16, 1957, demonstrable nonsense that I ask you to willfully ignore for now, to rather focus on his depiction of the place, which is otherwise valuable.
How you felt and what you discovered and kind of how things happened.
Well, at the time, I was out deer hunting, and I got a call to come back to the office. So the sheriff and I went out to his home, and we just got to the home when Dan Chase, the deputy, called by radio and stated that he found out where Ed Gein was.
At the Foster's place, huh?
Yeah. And so the sheriff told him, well, pick him up. And we busted into the house, which is totally illegal today. And
but you had a cause for
yeah. And the door we busted in was the back shed, which was connected to the house.
Yeah.
And it had about a 4-foot walk around the house side and the north side, about 3 foot higher than the ground. The rest went down to the ground about 2 feet. And there was no windows, and it was dark. And the sheriff at that time told me to go into the house, and he would inspect that shed.
Batterman mentions that, according to his description, except for a 4-foot walk on the house side and the north side, most of the shed was down to the ground, at a depth evaluated at 3 feet in one sentence and 2 in the next, which one can tell is inexact, although not completely wrong. And to demonstrate this, here's another mention of the same peculiarity taken from Ed Gein's Confessions, in which Joseph Wilimovsky, who used the word pit as to describe it, evaluates its depth at 2.5 feet, but its surface at 6 by 6 feet square. And if the trap was apparently conceived for the storing of comestibles, the pit, on the other hand, was obviously intended to the dressing out of animals, like deer, yes, as it was generally the custom in the area, but I guess all other kind of livestock too, like cows, hogs, goats, and whatnot. A human being in this case.
Her shoulders were right about in line with my chest, and I am slightly over 6 feet tall, so this would make it roughly her shoulders from the ground level were probably no more than 4.5 feet to the ground. You wouldn't have to stoop to get to her neck.
Whatever may have been the exact height the body was suspended from the ground, one can see here that the person who intended to measure it, I assume here the photographer, aka Alan Wilimovsky, for some unsettling reason, chose as a reference point Mrs. Worden's upside-down stiffening breast.
Titties up and down.
Oh, come on. No, that's just... come on. But also of interest here is another version of this picture, of a lesser quality, yet, on which we can get a better perspective on the body in relation to its environment, and also a view on the wooden door which one can see here opened, for a reason I suspect was essentially to make it easier for Alan Wilimovsky to reach and photograph the body. Not only had he himself reported that when he first came to Gein's house, he was directed to a solid wooden door that was painted white, with no windows, but the pictures he took for the State Crime Lab are the only ones on which one can see this door open. Seen from the point of view of someone standing in the doorway like James Halligan on this picture but looking the other way around, one can immediately tell by the presence of a wood stove, besides the recognizable stovepipe, that we are, in accordance with the legend so far, setting a foot for the first time in more than half a century, into Ed Gein's infamous kitchen. But perhaps should we take the opportunity of our first presence here to bring up an issue that we, dear fellow Geinologists, will inevitably need to address sooner or later, and that is to say, the behemothic shitload of contradictions, confusions, fictionalizations, if not downright fabrications, to be found in anything related to Gein's case. And of course, the more sensational it gets. Well, in the words of Joseph Wilimovsky,
people are ever ready to embellish, or put extra heavy topping or icing on a cake when you give them an opportunity. I don't think I know.
And talking about Wilimovsky, as you may have already noticed, two Wilimovsky were working for the State Crime Lab on the day of Gein's arrest. Alan, the firearm specialist who happens to be also the guy who took the pictures of Mrs. Worden's body, and his brother Joseph, the interrogatory specialist who happens to be the interviewer in the transcript commonly known as the Ed Gein's Confessions. And even them, otherwise brothers, both as credible as a State Crime Lab specialist can be, happen to tell, on a quite significant detail, two completely different stories. Was I to ask you, where do you think the police found Mrs. Worden's heart, it would be a common occurrence for you to answer, in a saucepan on the stove, and you would not be to blame for that, since it is an idea that went as far as to be printed on the back cover of America's Most Bizarre Murder, first official book written on the subject, by the no less credible than Judge Colmar, who himself presided at Gein's trial. On one hand, you got Alan Wilimovsky, claiming on page 24 of this edition of America's Most Bizarre Murderer, that the heart was found in a saucepan on the stove, which one can assume here is the one in the kitchen, a detail however clarified some 15 pages later, despite that the saucepan has seemingly morphed at some point into a stewpan, which I admit, not substantially corrupt the assertion, but nonetheless diverge from what is printed on the cover of the said book. Then, one reads in Dr. Eisenberger's report of the autopsy he conducted on Mrs. Worden's, that the heart was found in a plastic bag near the stove, which again, is left to the reader to assume which one it is. And finally, in Ed Gein's Confessions, again, another version, this one coming from Joseph Wilimovsky, who, asking Gein about what was his intentions in relation to Bernice Worden's heart, mentions that all over the radio and the newspapers, people claimed that he had planned on eating it, to which Gein retorts, and it was also told that it was on the table, on what Joseph immediately pushes back and say, and I quote, "No, I personally saw it on the floor within about 18 inches of your bed." In summary, depending on the source, Bernice Worden's heart has been either found in a saucepan on the stove, in a stewpan on the back of the kitchen stove, in a plastic bag near the stove, in a plastic bag near Gein's bed, or downright on the kitchen table. And I'm warning you, it is not going to get better anytime soon. In doing so, we are occasionally left with no other choice but to arbitrarily choose the version that suits us the best, which I can tell is not something on which a lot of people would lose a lot of sleep, but that can be quite unsettling to the one who is primarily interested in factuality. And this is why I deliberately choose here to stick to the documented sources, the autopsy report and the confessions which both mention a plastic bag near a stove, and put my confidence into Joseph Wilimovsky when he says that he himself saw this bag within about 18 inches of Gein's bed, which happened to also be near a stove. The bottom line being that, here my dear friends, is the stove on which the legend says that Bernice Worden's heart has been found in a saucepan. The next thing I bring your attention to is this box on the ground not that far from the stove, a box apparently filled with true crime magazines, which has been reportedly found in great quantity in Gein's house, but again, conveniently displayed to a suspicious point so that one can easily read the titles on their covers, one of which I've been able to identify as the September 1956 issue of Startling Detective magazine. Once again, I just want you to keep this information somewhere in the back of your mind for now, but assure you to break it all down as soon as possible.
I've got a perfect puzzle for you.
Contrarily to the previous one, this picture of the kitchen was originally published in the newspapers, which I suspect was taken prior to November 20th, and the reason for that is the presence of a huge Domino sugar bag here on this picture, that is not to be seen on the one published in Life magazine. Was the bag removed by the Life's photographer for aesthetical reasons, it would be no more surprising than a big deal, but if it hasn't, it would then imply that it has been taken away by the State Crime Lab, thus suggesting that it would have contained some type of horror yet to be discovered at this point of the investigation. Despite being one of the least interesting pictures to be found of Gein's kitchen, it is however the only one that I'm aware of on which we can confirm the presence of this window here situated at the left of the stove, that same window that we first deduced was overlooking the kitchen in the previous video. Also published in Life magazine, here's a picture of Bob Hill, one of Gein's friends, who, for some reason that again will probably remain a mystery, has been allowed to freely walk the crime scene, photographed here entering Gein's kitchen, what he reportedly hasn't done for years at this very point in time. Took, if I am not mistaken, by the same guy who went down the trap hole in the shed so to photograph the potbelly stove in which Gein used to cremate body parts, here's a picture of Captain Lloyd Scuffowester of Green Lake County, holding here in his hand what happens to be nothing but a plastic plane toy. Interestingly enough, in Ed Gein's confessions, Joseph Wilimovsky asks Gein how he would remove the skullcap of his victim, to which he answers that he would use a hacksaw, that he actually had two of them, and that they were located on the top of the kitchen cabinet, adding that in the same vicinity was also to be found an hand plane which presence, despite being mentioned, was never to be explained. And now, I want to bring your attention to a really specific detail, this little unidentified device here sitting on a magazine, situated on the edge of what I assume was originally the kitchen counter. In itself, of little use that's for sure, yet, combining it with a clip of a video figuring in the A&E biography episode dedicated to Ed Gein, allows us not only to authenticate the said video, but also to identify the magazine as an issue of Popular Science published in March 1957. Outside of the ad for Shrunken Head and the article on how to dig properly contained in this magazine, I would like to bring your attention not on its content but rather on the condition of its cover, on the fact that it was to be found on the kitchen counter, and that it has been released 8 months prior to when this picture was taken. And then, I invite you to compare your observations with this one here in that cardboard box situated about 3 feet from it, but at the floor level, an edition released 14 months prior, and not only conveniently displayed as mentioned earlier, but sitting on the top of what seems to be a bunch of them, which of course would fit the descriptions of Gein as an avid reader of this type of publications, contrarily to the fact that it sits on the top. And finally, this one here, 15 months old, again, on the top of a wooden crate but with which it has apparently no ties at all, a wooden crate by the way, that wasn't even there the day before when this picture was taken, left outright in the shed for more than a year, but with no trace of the edges of the pages even starting to wrinkle.
Et mon cul, c'est du poulet?
But please let's be careful here not to fall in the sludges of conspiracy thinking, behave in a responsible manner, respectful of the memories of the people involved, and, together, keep at a high level the standards of Geinology. That being said, I'm not racist, but hidden behind every divorce there's a Jew laughing at Jesus' dick. Open your eyes people, Mrs. Worden's was an inside job, Gein never existed, and... No way. And how is that even possible? Why not a wood plank while you're at it, I mean? Hey, thinking about it, where is that bed comes from? Is this the same bed Gein had slept since his early childhood, Or the one of his late brother maybe. Oh, creepy. Or maybe just one coming from a guest room upstairs. And what the fuck did happen on this mattress so that he felt the need to tear off the stuffing down to the spring frame? Oh yeah, well. Let's just move on, shall we? Right next to the bed, to the left on this picture, one can see here another potbelly stove somehow similar to the one in the shed, exactly where Joseph Wilimovsky claims to have seen Mrs. Worden's heart in a plastic bag which, according to Gein, was also filled with scraps of papers. Kindling matter for the stove, he said. But contrarily to what might have been depicted in some newspapers, that is to say that the heart would have been found on the kitchen table, which by the way was also near Gein's bed, a corner of it to be seen here on the right of this picture, an important information to keep in mind because, as some of you have maybe already noticed, there was no more kitchen table in the kitchen than enough place to fit one, which instantly discredit anything that can be said about stuff found on the table in the kitchen, except maybe if the word table is here substitutive of the word counter, a type of term confusion that would, contextually, be as to be expected than likely. Yeah. A really concise and enlightening sentence, the kind to be proud of. You bet I'm going to show it to my mommy. Yeah, why? Sure, you can take notes, I don't mind, but hey, listen to this, even better. Heart bag no table news Mr. Stinky Poopy. The point being that, contrarily to the cannibalistic intents attributed to him by the newspapers, Gein, on the other hand, said that he wanted to burn Mrs. Worden's heart in the stove, for a reason that, similarly to the one behind the presence of a hand plane in the kitchen, was never to be explained. Another demonstration of things being moved for what I assume is aesthetical purpose, is this rocking chair here at the extreme left on this picture, which one can determine that wasn't originally there when police first entered the house, but rather here, near the kitchen table, which may suggest that it was the chair on which Gein used to sit while eating his meals or reading one of the numerous books piled right next to him. But probably the most singular detail worthy of mention here in my opinion, is the way Gein had pushed his bed against the door as a barricade, to prevent it from ever being open. Going back to the previous picture, one can also notice here in the bottom right corner some musical instruments, again, obviously set up in an aesthetical manner, which not only can be used as a landmark to identify the next picture, but also corresponds to what can be read in Gein's psychological evaluation report, mentioning that
he is interested in music and plays the violin, the accordion, and the mouth organ. He enjoyed listening to music, preferring old-time music to modern. He lost his interest in music after the mother's death.
We can see here Dave Sharkey of Wood County, with in his hand Gein's violin, mouth organ, and what we can now add to the list, a zither, instruments by the way, that were all listed among Gein's possession available to bet on at the auction of his property, as one can see here written on the poster promoting the upcoming event. To our right, we can also see here the now familiar rocking chair, and to the left, get a glimpse at what is actually a bunch of books, piled all along a wall Gein had built up following his reconfiguration of his living space, thus segregating his bedroom from what is known in the legend as the rest of the house that has been boarded up. As one can see here, the police had at some point of the investigation, broken down a wall to access what was hidden behind, but also the presence of a type of curtain surmounted by macrame fringes, and at last but how much not the fucking least, a door here, slightly ajar on this picture, that used to lead nowhere but to the master bedroom of the house. You know, the type of bedroom in which sleep the master of the house. But just a last picture before we move on. One seemingly banal, that I've never seen anywhere but printed on page 847 of Murder Casebook number 24, that can be identified as belonging to Gein's bedroom, first, thanks to the wallpaper pattern, but also to the Heinz and Presto boxes next to a wood chair, that can be recognized on the next picture. But some of you might think, okay, but no wonder you never saw it anywhere else. Why taking such a picture in the first place? It's not like if the photographer had Geinology in mind, right, which of course would be a reasonable approach to adopt, but one revealing ignorance on the nature of what the police found at this very place.
The house had a path through the middle so you could walk around from one room to another. It was dark and the only thing you could see was what you saw with the flashlight. Everything was a mess. We also found Mary Hogan's mask that night. That was found behind the kitchen door. I picked it up. I don't know what possessed me to do it. The kitchen door was ajar and behind that was one of these old horsehide robes that they used to use years ago in the buggy. It was full of dust and dirt. I picked it up and saw a paper bag there. You could see the hair on it, you know, and I held onto the bag and flashlight and Specs was going to hold it up. "By God," he said, "it's Mary Hogan."
Taken from inside the rest of the house that has been boarded up, this is the only picture that I'm aware of on which one can see where exactly the door connecting the bedroom to the kitchen was situated, the very door behind which has been found Mary Hogan's face, but also numerous other details that one can otherwise see only on separated different pictures. First, the Heinz and Presto boxes next to a wood chair identified on the previous picture. The rocking chair and the potbelly stove from this one. The macrame fringes from this other one. And finally, the books piled all along the broken down wall of which we can only perceive the beginning on this one, but that can be connected together thanks to the presence of this book here sitting on the top, Dorothy Dale, A Girl of Today by Margaret Penrose. Now, let's see what we can tell about the rest of the house that was boarded up. Probably the most famous picture took from inside Gein's house. We can look here at what actually used to constitute the parlor of the said house, but in order to get a better perspective, here another picture, took approximately from the same place, which allows us to more effectively scrutinize the place in its very details.
Augusta was happy with the homestead, and in truth, it was a substantial place, particularly by the standards of that underprivileged area. She promptly set about arranging the rooms with the sparse, but solid furnishings she had gradually acquired during the years of her marriage. The best pieces were reserved to the parlor, which contained a handsome cherry bureau, its breakfront decorated with a simple leaf design, a stout wooden rocker with elaborately carved arm supports, a small pine bookcase, its 5 narrow shelves neatly stacked with leather-bound volumes, a large oriental carpet, slightly threadbare but with a rich geometric pattern, and a number of pictures on the walls, including family portraits in heavy gilded frames, and Augusta's favorite, a reproduction painting of Christ gazing skyward at an angel.
So, this is it, huh? This was the room that has been boarded up. Because I've heard it was Augusta's bedroom. But, if it wasn't, where are all the pictures fitting the description of a bed made next to a night table, on which there's a Bible covered with dust, and must, and spider webs, and all that good stuff? As disappointing it might be, dear and estimated fellow gynologist, the answer to this question is simply nowhere to be found. Not a single one. At least, not on the regular Johnny McNormy non-dark web on which I evolve. Maybe somewhere in a private collection, in a folder forgotten in Plainfield's archives, or in one of the boxes filled with Grandpa's junk that you indiscriminately threw away when he kicked the proverbial bucket. At any rate, nothing in the reach of my amateurish capacities. So, until proven otherwise, a complete mystery will remain on this part of the house. As for the second floor, by the way, which one can tell was still accessible since police found bowls made of skullcaps up there, but that no picture allows us to situate where on the map was the stair leading to it. Which bring us back to Georgia Foster, the neighbor mentioned earlier who knew and trusted Gein enough to let him babysit her newborn, who visited his house in the spring of 1957, and who mentions in an interview accorded to the newspapers, the accessibility of the second floor. Oh, and for those who might not know, the reason why she and her husband visited Gein in the first place is that he had in mind to move for a while, leaving behind all the bad memories linked to this sinister place, and proposed them a house trade which, in a more regular context, would have been advantageous from a Foster point of view. So they came, they saw, and needless to say, that a deal has never been concluded. Here's her recollection of that day.
We went to look his place over. We looked into all the rooms except the front bedroom, and one room right off what I suppose was originally the dining room, but that Ed used for a bedroom and living room. He had the door closed to that one room.
In other words, the entirety of the first floor of Block C. Note here that it would make sense for her to call that the front bedroom since, as we have established in the previous video, people used to get on the property so that they would leave their car in front of that very part of the house, and having in mind that it had been boarded up, we can assume that this door here would have been of no use, no more than this one since Gein had condemned it by pushing his bed against it, which leaves us with no other option than this one here, the one of the shed, seemingly used as the main entrance of the house, or, in other words, the front of the house. Back to Georgia Foster.
We looked into all the rooms except the front bedroom, and one room right off what I suppose was originally the dining room, but that Ed used for a bedroom and living room. He had the door closed to that one room.
Let's pause it again. Notice the choice of word here. He had the door closed to that one room. A door that he kept closed, thus implying a matter of choice, and not a literal boarding up in the spirit of a crude wooden barricade like one might have in mind in a given context. Because if one looked closely at this picture combined with another clip shot in Gein's house, one can see that the entrance to the parlor consisted of a doorway about 6 feet wide, that Gein had first installed a stud in the middle of it, and then a nogging so to reinforce the right side of the wall, as opposed to the left one, which makes sense otherwise how could anyone enter the parlor like Dave Sharkey is seen doing right here. And if we look back and closer to that same famous picture taken of the parlor from Gein's bedroom, one can't deny here the presence of what is unquestionably some type of metal handle, hidden in fucking plain sight all along for everybody and their mama to see, which implied that the boarding up would not have been, properly speaking, a definite one, meaning that. Hey, wait a minute. Meaning what exactly? Yes, okay, there was a door, but we know as a fact that no one had set a foot in there for years, right? I mean. But do we? Without a doubt. And why a door then? Okay, I'm pissed now. Jesus Christ, is there any end to this shit? They told me it would be fun, but it's more like crossing a fucking bullshit minefield blowing up in your fucking face every fucking step you. And why is truth always so fucking bleak, god damn it. You can all go fuck yourselves until it bleeds as far as I'm concerned, and then use the blood as a loop to fuck yourselves again you bunch of. You know what, I leave this one up to the little sickly minds of yours to make up whatever fit your own fantasies, because, I mean, at this point, I'm getting tired, and you know, other stuff to do, not your business. Back to Georgia Foster.
The place was awfully dirty and full of stuff piled all over the floor. It was pretty dark too, so we couldn't see much. We were looking at the plaster and the things you look at if you're thinking about trading houses. Naturally, we didn't look for anything like the things they say they found. If I came to your house, would I be looking at the chairs to see if they were made from human skin? I pointed to one of the upstairs bedrooms and I said, "Is that where you keep your shrunken heads?"
Oh yeah, because, yes, in case you didn't know, there were already rumors in Plainfield about Gein having shrunken heads at home sent to him by a cousin serving in the Philippines or something. Some kids saw them and told their parents. But again, you know, kind of pissed, it's all in deviant anyway, so, just read it and leave me alone.
I pointed to one of the upstairs bedrooms and I said, "Is that where you keep your shrunken heads?" He gave me a funny look, and I wished I hadn't said it. But then Ed gave that little grin of his and pointed to another room upstairs. "No," he said, "they're in this other room here."
March 20th, 1958, around 2:30 a.m., Bert Carlson, policeman of Plainfield, notices a strange orange glow in the night sky, visible from the village about 7 miles away, and immediately reports it to the chief of the fire department, who happens to be no one but Bernice Worden's son. By the time the firemen get there, there wasn't anything left to do other than prevent the fire from spreading to the surrounding outbuildings. No official cause of the fire has never been established, and the least one can say is that no one in Plainfield seemed to give the least of a piece of f***. Not even Gein, actually.
News of the fire reached Gein himself later that morning.
I went to Ed's room and I told him that his house had burned down. And he made a gesture just as well, the exact words that he said.